drones are increasingly present in fields, forests, and rural communities, but their real impact depends on how innovation connects with real needs on the ground. I am Ep.3 from reframe.food, and this is the Icaerus podcast series. As you know, innovation projects often produce impressive technologies, but turning those technologies into solutions that actually work in the real world requires something entirely different, a viable business model. In this Icaerus podcast episode, I am joined by my colleague George Papapostolou, who is team leader for exploitation at reframe.food and has been leading the business model development within the Icaerus project. Hi, George.
Hi, Dimitra. Nice to see you, and thank you for having me.
Nice to see you. George, before we dive into Icaerus specifically, let's start with something foundational. When people talk about the business model, what do they actually mean?
Well, when people hear business models, they often imagine a canvas filled with boxes, or maybe something akin to a pitch deck. But a business model is not a template, and it's certainly not a drawing. It's something much more fundamental. A business model mostly describes the logic, how value is captured and how value is created. And it explains how an idea can move from being a concept to becoming something that survives and operates in the real world, in the market, let's say, environment. It's essentially an engine that keeps innovation alive once a funding cycle ends. And it answers very practical questions. So, for example, what problem are we trying to solve? Who is experiencing that particular problem? Why they would prefer our solution over alternatives, and so on and so forth. But crucially, I think most importantly, a business model mostly explores how a solution can sustain itself over time, financially, operationally, and sometimes even culturally.
So if I understand correctly, it's almost like the blueprint for survival in the real world.
Yeah, and it brings us to that relationship between invention and innovation, because there is much confusion on what innovation is, and I very much prefer a definition of innovation that is coming out of MIT, where they say that innovation is invention times marketability, and it's a multiplication. Because innovation is not just about creating something new. It's about successfully introducing a novelty into the market, meaning that you can have an extraordinary invention in your hands, but if it never leaves the lab or the pilot, it then remains simply an invention, not an innovation. Conversely, you can commercialize something efficiently many times,
Yes,
but
okay.
if there is no real novelty, then again, if you don't have innovation embedded itself, then again, it's simply something commercial.
So it's like innovation only exists when the invention actually reaches people who use it.
Exactly, and the business model comes into play because it's what connects these two dimensions. It's the bridge between invention and market adoption, between what we create and whether it will actually sustain itself. In a project like Icaerus, for example, this matters enormously because we're developing drone-based solutions across many domains. So we have agriculture, forestry, livestock monitoring, rural logistics, sectors that are different from each other, and they are very complex. Sophistication in technology cannot ensure by itself market uptake. On the contrary, in fact, we find that many technologies fail not because they don't work, but because they don't fit into a viable business model. So we found ourselves in a position that we have to ask some very pertinent questions. So who pays for this? Under what conditions does it operate beyond the project or could operate beyond the project? Is it affected by a regulatory environment, and how much affected is the innovation because of regulation? Do users trust and understand the technology, which is very applicable, particularly in Icaerus? Because again, we're servicing some very sensitive sections and some very sensitive sectors of the economy. And are those users ready to integrate our innovations into their practices? So none of these are actually engineering questions. These are all business model questions. A good business model forces us to confront reality, to confront the market reality, because it also brings us in a position to challenge assumptions, to examine the market, to delve into customer behavior, cost structures, competition, regulation, as I said earlier. So a good business model, let's say, that it turns our ambition to make our innovation commercial into structured reasoning and hopefully into something that will have a long-term adoption.
What I keep from your reply before is that none of these are engineering questions and that they are actually business model questions. This is what I liked most from your answers. So what I understand is that in simple words, in simple terms, the business model is the architecture that transforms a technological result into actual sustainable impact. Is that correct?
I would say yes. I mean, without it, the project ends, and so does the innovation embedded in the project.
Yes. So George, once you start seeing business models this way, the next question becomes, how do you actually analyze or design a business model? Could you walk us through this process?
Yes, of course. Well, in Icaerus, for example, we did our best and we anchored the process in, let's say, established techno-economic practices. We didn't invent new methodology, and I don't believe that there was a need for let's say, rediscovering the wheel. We went by the book, and this was deliberate. We used established tools that provide structure and a common language. These allowed all project partners and all project stakeholders, maybe they were engineers, agronomists, economists, everyone, to contribute meaningfully to the same analysis and, of course, understand the mechanics of the analysis. And that's important because business models emerge mostly from insights coming from various doctrines and various disciplines, not from, let's say, isolated silos of thinking. So our starting point was market analysis. We did this not because we wanted to look sophisticated, but because it provides the bedrock upon which you can build your business model. And it also focuses your thinking process. So this forced us to ask, where do our innovations coming out of the project could actually live? For example, for that analysis, we used a very common use tool, a TAM-SUM-SOM framework, the total addressable market, serviceable market, and so on. Now, this framework narrows the universe from the total theoretical demand down to what you can realistically reach in practice. This, let's say, process is also a narrowing process which is transformative because it shifts us from this, let's say, mentality that, okay, my innovation could be used everywhere and could be useful to everyone, to a mentality, a much more realistic, let's say, take, which is, this is where we can realistically fit.
And once you know the size and the boundaries of the opportunity, what happens then?
Well, then you look at market structures, for example. You can look at stuff like techno-economic indices. We used the concentration ratio, for example, the Herfindahl and Hirschman index. These are indices and indicators that, first of all, they're very well known when you're conducting a techno-economic analysis. Some might say that they're almost traditional indices. But these indicators help us understand whether we're entering a fragmented market, for example, where there are lots of economic actors going about their own businesses, or whether we're entering a market which is, let's say, moderately competitive. Or maybe we are facing a market where there is high concentration and it's dominated by very few big players. Of course, this that distinction really matters because imagine designing a solution for a market that you may think is open and full of opportunity, only to discover later on that look, there are only 3 or 4, let's say, incumbents, major companies that take up 80% of the activity and the overall market value of your particular sector. Then this means that your business model must reflect that reality. Or the opposite. A fragmented market, for example, might offer much more room for differentiation than expected. This means that you can also play around more with your own innovation. And then we move from that, let's say, a little bit static techno-economic analysis, techno-economic X-ray, let's say, of the market landscape to a more dynamic one. So we used, for example, other very well-established techno-economic tools like Porter's five forces, regulatory analysis. We looked into supplier powers, buyer power, other potential substitutes for our innovations. I would say that drone services, in particular, can live or die by regulatory nuance. So a small regulatory change can eliminate an entire business model or create a new one overnight. For example, we have the agricultural drones that are meant to carry a particular payload up to a particular. They need to be up to a particular size, and they need to be able to fly around particular zones. So everything that concerns that particular aspect of the technological side of our innovation is subject to regulatory restrictions and regulatory guidelines. So only after that external ecosystem is mapped well enough can we move inward to the value proposition, to the revenue lawrence, and talk about and think about things like cost structure and sustainability dimensions and all that good stuff, and eventually then come out and, let's say, build a business model canvas. And this is the key, that the canvas comes near the end, not at the beginning, and it should never be at the beginning. If you fill the canvas too early, then you're just drawing a wish list. You're making things a little bit up. You're imagining stuff. And usually we find out that the market has its own ideas of imposing reality on business models.
This caught me by surprise, to be honest, that the canvas comes near the end and not at the beginning. I understand that if you fill the canvas too early, then it's not exactly correct. So because of this might surprise other people too, George. Could you let us know why or how it happened that most people often think that the business model canvas is actually the business model?
Yeah. That's a misunderstanding that we encounter often. A canvas is not the business model. That goes without saying. A canvas is a representation, a one-page representation or a one-page map of the key components of a business model. For that reason alone, it is incredibly useful, but it's still a map. The real business model is the logic behind the map. The reasoning why these boxes are being filled the way they are. That logic only emerges after you have done market analysis, after you have looked into structures, competitors, regulations, external pressures, and so on. So the canvas is valuable, but it is a snapshot of something deeper. By itself, it's just, as I said, a very clean way of capturing decisions, but it's not. It doesn't provide the rationale behind those decisions.
Thank you for explaining the theory and the practices behind it, but now I would like to come back to the Icaerus project per se. So once all that groundwork that you explained is in place, how did you choose? How do you choose the framework? And specifically, what framework did you choose for Icaerus?
Yeah. For Icarus, we got lucky because we selected the triple R business model canvas. And the triple R business model canvas expands on the traditional economic layer of the business model canvas that most people are very well accustomed with. And it provides two additional layers. It provides an environmental layer and a social layer. Now, this was essential for Icarus because our solutions do not operate in purely commercial environments. Our innovations operate in fields, they operate in forests, they operate in rural landscapes, under regulatory demanding systems, and in community settings as well. So, economic viability, of course, matters, and it matters immensely. It is the beginning of our analysis, but environmental and social legitimacy also matters very much in the case of Icarus. I would say that for some of our innovations, it's just as important. So, using the triple-layered canvas, we were given the ability to ask three parallel questions. Does our innovation make economic sense? So again, you begin from that, no question about this. But at the same time, we could also ask, does it benefit or harm the environment, which was core in our innovation? And also at the same time, we could ask, does it create value for people and community?
This essentially broadens the definition of viability, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And in that case, weaknesses or contradictions also become visible very quickly. A financially viable model that harms the environment through Icarus won't survive long in agriculture, and we need our innovations to survive in agriculture. A technically strong model that, for example, maybe lacks community acceptance may never scale. So the triple-layered canvas makes these tensions visible. It helps us map everything, both, let's say, it creates this opportunity to map all of these issues, both vertically and horizontally, and it helps us afterwards to resolve them better.
And George, once you applied all this analysis, what stood out? Were there any surprises?
Yes, there were several surprises, and some of them were very interesting. I mean, everything comes out of the fact that the operational realities of the 5 use cases of Icarus were far more different than what we expected. So again, we have agriculture, forestry monitoring, livestock management, rural logistics. Each of those things have its own structures, its own cost sensitivities, different cultural expectations at some point, and of course, regulatory frameworks. On the surface, one could say that they're all drone applications. So they have something that they share in common, and they could be maybe addressed uniformly. But underneath, they're completely different, and they generate completely different economic ecosystems. Second, many of our strongest value propositions weren't financial. So they were either environmental or social. Maybe in a case we reduced chemical use. Maybe we improved soil and crop monitoring. Maybe we lowered CO2 emissions. Or we provided an opportunity for safer working conditions. So these are, let's say, forms of value that in a traditional financial model, they're overlooked. Or let's say that they're taken into consideration, but they're not given the same gravity. But rural stakeholders care very deeply about issues such as the ones I mentioned earlier. At the same time, regulatory clarity or the lack of regulatory clarity in some cases, as I said early on, changes everything in drone innovation. So some drone operations, like heavy payload transport or autonomous flights in maybe in populated areas, fall into a higher risk regulatory category. This means that they may be commercially promising, but at the same time, they could be very slow to reach any meaningful large-scale adoption. And finally, after all of this, I think what we found out was a very distinct and very clear pattern emerged that many applications uh, naturally involved towards a service-based model rather than, let's say, looking at the hardware component of our drone operations, as an equipment sale, for example.
Does this mean that you're not actually selling the drone, but you're selling what the drone does?
Yes, exactly. I would say that you are selling capability and not hardware. And we should mention here that, I mean, even academically in the research and also techno-economically, the drone market is considered a hybrid market. It's considered that it is a market of both software and hardware. But what we found out through our analysis is that mostly our business models were coming out towards a service-based business, let's say, business mentality. This means that again, it's all about the ability of the drone and not the actual hardware that it is, let's say, operated by the drone. And this shift opens entirely new ecosystems of operators, service providers, rural advisors, technology integrators, and so on.
So, from what I know, George, Icaerus covers 5 very different sectors. Do the business models differ across them?
Indeed, they do. Absolutely, they do. And the diversity of the business models is one of the project's strengths. But again, despite the differences, there is also a strong indication of convergence between the business model. Most use cases, and when we did the, let's say, the analysis with our own partners and with the task leaders who developed the innovations, most use cases pointed towards a drone as a service model. So instead of farmers or forestry operators buying and maintaining drones, we found out that it is far more efficient and made far more, let's say, financial sense that they access the capability through, let's say, a specialized service provider. First of all, this dramatically lowers the barrier to entry into the market, meaning that, okay, for example, farmers don't want to be drone pilots or compliance experts. They only want a solution that will work. In precision agriculture, for example, the real value is not the drone itself, but any insights you can get out of the use of the drone. Crop maps, maybe targeted spraying zones, early detection of diseases in plants, and so on and so forth. In forestry, maybe it's about improved ecosystem monitoring, and in livestock, maybe it's about safer, more efficient management. In rural logistics, it was about connecting remote areas to essential services. So, although each use case lives in a different environment, far different than the sector next to it, many of them converge towards the same operational logic. So we have specialized operators delivering drone-enabled services at scale. And I think that this is perhaps the most important conclusion, that Icaerus is not only demonstrating drone technologies, but it is also uncovering, let's say, how these technologies can realistically function within real rural economies. At the end of the day, innovation only matters if it is applicable, if it works in the real world, if it can be sustained in a real market. And that's what a strong business model does. It tries to make that transition, let's say, from the drawing board to the market environment as possible and viable.
I really liked your comment that at the end of the day, innovation only matters if it works in the real world, George. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast series.
Thank you, Dimitra. It was a pleasure.
This was a deep dive into a topic that often stays invisible behind the scenes, but it truly determines whether innovation lives or dies. For those watching or listening, this episode is part of the Icaerus podcast series, where we look at how drones are being assessed and used in real agricultural and rural contexts across Europe. More episodes are already available, and follow Icaerus on social media or visit the project website to stay informed. Thank you for joining us.